Hello. The bill to allow same-sex marriage won a second reading in the House of Commons and now goes to committee stage and then to the Lords for further discussion. The main Christian churches have expressed their opposition to the bill, although not all their members agree with them. What of the country's second largest religious grouping, the Muslims? The Muslim Council of Britain is certainly opposed. In some Muslim countries, the practice of homosexuality carries the death penalty, and there have been recent examples where such sentences have been carried out. So what does Islam say about homosexuality? Is the prohibition absolute? Joining me to discuss Islam's attitude towards homosexuality are Ibrahim Mogra, an Imam in Leicester and a member of the Muslim Council of Britain, Pav Akhtar, who's a gay Muslim politician and the director of Black Pride UK, and Dr. Muhammad Al-Hussaini, an Islamic scholar and secretary of Scriptural Reasoning, a charity which brings together scholars from various traditions to read their sacred texts together. Ibrahim, can you be a Muslim and gay?
Yes, you can be Muslim and gay. Our issue as Muslims is against the sexual act itself, not against homosexual people. Homophobia is wrong. Prejudice and intimidation of homosexual people is wrong.
But let's just make it clear, as far as you're concerned, physical genital acts between homosexuals are wrong.
Indeed, physical, intimate, genital relationships between two people of the same sex is wrong, as it is wrong between two people of opposite sex when they're not married to each other.
Now, Pav, you are yourself gay, so I would expect you to affirm that you can indeed be Muslim and gay.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I take my position from the Quran itself, which says that God created people, male and female, into different communities and different tribes, and so that we ought to know one another. And that really is my starting point, which is that I think one can be a person of faith within Islam and be incredibly diverse, as the previous speaker has outlined.
Muhammad?
Well, I think, diversity is part of the plan of creation, and combined with that is the principle that we are all absolutely equal as children of God.
I hear that. I hear the diversity that is being referred to, but we shouldn't really be getting carried away with this. This is the diversity in terms of culture, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language. There is no serious scholarship that has made any reference here to the diversity of sexuality, because for that we have other verses in the Quran that spell it out very, very clearly, that it is the man and the woman that God has created who come together in marriage.
Well, let me just put that to Pav. The Quran, according to Ibrahim, it is unambiguous in saying that marriage is for male and female.
Well, let me start with this position, which is that I think that being a lesbian, a gay person, and an LGBT person is a natural disposition rather than one that one assumes by choice. So I start from that premise, and I then move on to what the Quran says or doesn't say. I think the Quran very obliquely references homosexuality, and it doesn't, in my view, assess homosexuals negatively.
Well, let's look at what the Quran actually says, and one story, it appears to me, is most directly relevant to this whole situation. That's what is called in the Hebrew Scriptures the Lot story, and Lut in the Quran. And if I can briefly summarise it, Lut was a prophet sent to Sodom and Gomorrah to recall the people to God, and two visitors arrived unexpectedly. They were young, good-looking men, and the people of Sodom tried to snatch them away, and Lut tried to save them. But it was in vain, because they were kidnapped and they were raped, and the city of Sodom, as a result, was destroyed by God. Now, Ibrahim, what message do you derive from that? What's the direct message of that story?
It's important for us to appreciate and understand the fact that a vast chunk of the Quran really is narrative, stories of the past. And those stories are not just there for the sake of entertaining us or amusing us. Those stories are for us to learn lessons from. So when we recite the passage of Lot and how the people were destroyed, that should really create fear in our hearts of what happens when people disobey God. So
and in your understanding, Ibrahim, that the way that they had disobeyed God was by committing homosexual acts?
Indeed. Lot himself made an offer to them. He tried to reason with them. He tried to make them understand that God has made females as mates for you, yet they chose not to do it that way. And so that disobedience of God resulted in their destruction.
There's also a verse in the Quran that suggests that this was the sin that had never been committed before, as if it was at that point in history when this became a reality.
Indeed, we could take that to mean exactly that, the literal meaning that this was the first time this ever happened. However, the Quran's style is such that when it wants to highlight the magnitude of something that is so unacceptable, it does make reference to it as if it's the first time.
Pav?
I mean, the story of the Prophet Lut is the one that's often quoted in terms of the condemnation of homosexuality within Islam. What was being condemned, I mean, and there are progressive scholars who've reviewed the text, is the lewd behaviour in the sense of there was widespread promiscuity, there was bestiality, there was paedophilia, there was inhospitability towards guests. I mean, those are the different types of things that were going on. It's questions of abuse of power, of rape, of intimidation. That's what's being condemned per se. What the conservative tract is that we then extrapolate from that this is a condemnation outright of homosexuality. And I just don't arrive at the same conclusion.
Muhammad?
Well, in relation to the story, Muslim commentators pick up on previous Jewish rabbinic commentary that talks about the sin of Sodom, not just as being about sexual sin, but also about the oppression of poor people, injustice against the poor. And the Quran has much more to say about those issues than about sex.
Let's move on to the Hadith, which is the sayings of the Prophet. It doesn't have the same authority as the Quran, and it's open to interpretation, and there are disputes about which ones are authentic or not. But let me give you just two quotes. When a man mounts another man, the throne of God shakes. And then there's another one that says, kill the one that is doing it, and also kill the one that it is being done to. Pav, what do you make of those sayings?
My view is, can these negative assessments in the oral tradition and jurisprudence, are they in accord with what the scriptures intended? And are these non-scriptural sources authentic and therefore reliable for Muslims? I mean, my point is simply this, that the hadith is not divine, in terms of it's not the Quran, it's not the scripture as is.
Yes, Pav,
Ibrahim.
but Pav, of course the hadith is not Quran, but without the hadith, understanding the Quran becomes extremely difficult.
And this is the fundamental issue around, the condemnation of homosexuality. When the Quran obliquely references homosexuality, and we've already touched upon the story of the Prophet Lut.
Yes, but when you made reference to the other wrong things that the people of Lot were doing, so why is that the case that the verse of the Quran then specifically mentions this act as if it was not done before by anybody else? That was if you like, the last straw that broke the camel's back, in a sense. The hadith, of course, comes in a variety of authenticity. These are critical scriptures that help you to understand. So when you extract law from scripture and formulate the laws, they supplement and complement one another.
Is it your view, Ibrahim, that these phrases, these are authentic hadith and therefore have to influence the way that we interpret the Quran?
Authentication of the hadith is a very serious matter. Once a hadith is authenticated as being sound and correct, then that forms a very fundamental cornerstone of formulation of a law with regards to that. And that is what the jurists will go by. And that legal ruling will then become binding.
Muhammad?
Islam doesn't recognise homosexuality so much as human sexuality, and so the penalty isn't so much directed at one form of sexual relation so much as extramarital sexual relation, and the religious scholars dispute the nature of that interpretation in regard to the applicability of the law. So there are disputes between the Hanafi versus the Hanbali schools of law in relation to this.
Just to get back to the principle. The principle that when a man mounts another man, the throne of God shakes. How do you respond to that? Forget about the law for the moment. How do you respond to that as a principle?
Well, I think Islam has a lot of things to say about the natural order of things, and family life is central to that natural order. In the Islamic structure of family life, there does not appear to be a positive reference. And that's why I speak with tremendous compassion, but also with integrity, to find a positive reference to affirm same-sex physical relationships.
Pav, what Muhammad seems to be saying is that unless there is something that specifically affirms homosexuality in the Quran, you have to assume that it is forbidden.
No, I don't subscribe to that in the sense that, as I said to you earlier on, I think the Quran is incredibly oblique. Where there are terms which have been used to describe homosexuality, they're very much based in interpretation. I think there are 6 or 7 different words which have often been used to suggest reference to homosexuality per se. And for me, we come from a tradition within the Muslim community of an incredibly patriarchal, heterosexist tradition, which doesn't often take into account the views of or reading of the scriptures from a feminist perspective, from an LGBT-friendly perspective, for example. So the idea that we should accept the hadith uncritically, as if it were scripture, it simply for me doesn't stand.
There's a story in the hadith of Muhammad which I find very interesting about the fact that he allowed some transvestites to visit his wives when they were unveiled, because in a sense he felt that they were no threat to him. Now, an interesting story, and I'm sure it's a nuanced story, but it seems to suggest that Muhammad at some point was quite willing to embrace different forms of sexuality.
Yes, I mean, within pre-Islamic Arabic culture, there were wide varieties of different practices, and the Prophet has demonstrated considerable pragmatism in relation to that. And more broadly, very great pragmatism in relation to matters that are sexual. I think what the story suggests is a prophet that is tolerant of a variety of different practices and beliefs. And that doesn't mean that if you have bound yourself into a covenant to live a Muslim life, that all practices are permissible, and I think Brother Ibrahim identified some of those points. But that doesn't mean that in a country like this we're going to try and shut down all the pubs and ban bacon and eggs, and it doesn't mean that the Prophet was there to wipe out everybody that was different.
I'd like to move on to the Middle Ages, and particularly the Ottoman Empire, because I'm very interested in researching this programme to read some of the poetry that came out of that time. Much of it love poetry, and much of it, Pav, about love for young men. And very often when you read that poetry, there's a parallel between the love of a man for a young boy and the love of a man for God.
I think there's enormous reference and appreciation of male sexuality throughout the Ottoman Empire. I mean, this is the same Ottoman Empire that I think in 1858 decriminalised homosexuality.
100 years before the UK, it's got to be said.
So I constantly re-emphasise this point about who is doing the interpretation, because we've gone through a period in the Islamic world where we were open to diversity, we were open to different viewpoints, and we've come to a much more closed world, I think, in the Islamic community, in contemporary Islamic community.
I think Pav's approach to the whole issue is one of falling back time and again on diversity. Just because a certain group of elite Muslims practice this does not legitimize it. Like, for example, you could have today someone writing poetry about sexuality with their sibling, for example, or some incestuous.
But the point, Ibrahim, is
100 years down the road, this collection cannot be used as evidence to say, because in 2013 we have these volumes of poetry, does not make it legitimate or legal.
Why are we focusing on this issue more so, rather than on so many other issues? I mean, it's become this sort of totem pole around which we're dancing, and I just don't agree that, this is the de facto issue for the Muslim world.
Muhammad.
No, absolutely. Well, I think Brother Pav highlights a very important point. What is the actual preoccupation of the Quran? The preoccupation of the Quran is the worship of the one God and the doing of justice to the poor and to the orphans, and to stand up for economic justice. That's the emphasis within Islam in relation to what's central and important to our faith.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing Islam's attitude towards homosexuality. Most Muslim scholars are unequivocal in declaring it to be forbidden. So where does that leave a Muslim man or woman who is gay? And with me are Ibrahim Mogra, Muhammad Al-Hussaini and Pav Akhtar. Ludovic Mohammed Zahid was brought up in a French Muslim family. In his teens he adopted a very conservative Salafi form of Islam. But he has gone on to set up what he calls an inclusive mosque in Paris, where he says gays are welcome. I asked him when he realised that he was gay.
I was 17 years old, and I realized the brother that helped me learn the Quran by heart, I was in love with him. So that was the first time after 5 years within the Salafi Brotherhood that I discovered that I was gay. And I thought at that time, either I am a pervert, like they're telling me that homosexuals are all perverts, or the Islam they taught me is a fake. It took me 7 years to get back to Islam because I was so depressed and I was suffering so much that I was not able to decide whether something was wrong with me.
Now, recently I know that you have become married, and you were married to your male partner in a mosque by an imam. Tell me about that.
After something like more than 10 years, I came out to my parents. I was something like 21 years old. They told me, my mother told me, I understood that you're suffering very much because of us. So now that we know it's not a disease, that we know you're not going to change, now we have to find a partner and we will accept him as our son. And they did. So that's when I met Qiyamuddin in South Africa, I decided to give it a try, and now we've been together for almost 3 years.
You've been part of opening an inclusive mosque, a gay-friendly mosque. Why do you think that's needed?
I did not understand that a few years ago when I heard about the first inclusive mosque opened in North America. But then when I was out, visible in the media about my same-sex couple and being married in front of an imam and so on, people came to me and they told me, I'm transgender. I could not go to regularly to a traditional mosque because people look at me and they point their finger at me and they tell me, you should not dress like this, you should not behave like this, and so on and so forth. And I had women coming to me and telling me, I do not want to go to a mosque where I pray behind the imam, behind hundreds of men sometimes. I don't even see the imam. I have to wear a scarf. My voice is not heard, and so on and so forth. So I founded that inclusive mosque in Paris because many people are suffering from the fact that they are not included in traditional mosque. And we would like to promote an inclusive, gay-friendly, feminist, alternative representation of Islam.
What would you say to those Muslims who will assert that marriage is between a male spouse and a female spouse?
I mean, nature, God, whatever you want to call it, decided the other way, decided that homosexuals will be part of our humanity, and that's it. We have to accept it. So what do we do with that? Do we ask homosexual people like me to be, virgins forever, like some imams told me? So in the mosque, the inclusive mosque, we are trying to free our brothers and sisters from those oppressive representations of Islam that has nothing to do with spirituality, but has more something to do with Islam as a totalitarian tradition.
What would you say if an imam came to you and said, what you're doing is haram, forbidden, you are disobeying the rules of Allah?
I would tell him, what you say, what you do, excluding homosexuals just because they are who they are, is haram. This is clearly against the Islamic ethic.
That was Ludovic Muhammad Zahid. And Ibrahim, is his marriage valid in the eyes of God?
Not at all. I think the imam who conducted his so-called marriage should have known that the terms and conditions for a Muslim marriage require one partner to be male and the other to be female. But I've been listening to a number of arguments that have been presented here. And the idea of Islam being evolving is one which is very appealing to myself. But there has to be a line that is drawn. We cannot continue to accommodate things that are against the laws of God, things that are forbidden. Today we could be arguing for 2 men to be married, 2 women to be married. 100 years down the road, if we use the same argument of evolvement of Islam and Islam evolving and meeting the needs of the time, are we going to argue the case for a brother and a sister to be married?
Pav,
Well, firstly, I object to the consistent referencing of sexual relations between siblings as if that's in any way comparable to love or a loving relationship between two homosexual people. It absolutely isn't the same thing.
Pav, have you not heard of a brother and sister falling in love and having incestual relationship?
What I'm saying to you is that your constant equating of homosexual love with incest is not something I agree with, and I find it offensive.
So where do we draw the line then?
Well, we draw the line by not equating homosexuality to incest, because it isn't incest.
Let's just come back to our interview for a moment, Mohammed, because Ludovic believes he needed to set up an inclusive mosque. Do you understand that?
Well, I think the assertion for an inclusive mosque needs to be seen in the context of what's taken place in the Muslim world as a whole. Within this country, for example, only 5% of mosques have room for women, let alone anybody else. So there are very serious issues, and I do want to respond very much to the pain and the hurt and the rejection that has been asserted in this context, because it really warrants our compassion. So in responding,
Ludovic's hurt is all about the fact that his disposition and his actions and his search for love are being rejected by a large part of his community.
Absolutely, and it's quite right that we understand the abject hypocrisy of religious leaders in asserting very brutal and very uncompassionate responses to people like that. So yes, that pain needs to be responded to.
Mohammed.
I don't see the need for inclusive mosques, so-called, because any homosexual person is most welcome to my mosque and pray with me. And I would be the first to condemn any prejudice or intimidation or bullying of some Muslim who is gay. I would continue to say that such behavior is a sin in the eyes of God and it should be stopped, but these are two different things.
Mohammed, what do you make of the imam who married Ludovic? A phrase that Ludovic said in that interview remains with me. He said, "Do you want us to remain virgins all our lives?"
Yes, and I think it's important that homosexual relationships, that we recognise them in the context of the Quran and the ethics of the Quran and the values within the Quran, and that is about the ethical reciprocity of love, of justice, of trust. Those things that we give to heterosexual relationships ought to be based on the values of the Quran, and similarly within the homosexual context, I would argue that our contractual relationships within the homosexual world, if you like, ought to be given the same parity as heterosexual ones. I mean, that to me is a more ethical and benign way in which we can engage and support and build and revise, if you like, or reform this conservative narrative that we've constructed over centuries, because the breadth of narrative that's been written has come from a very patriarchal standpoint.
Given that we all know that the sexual impulse is one of the most powerful that we have, if gay people could marry, in terms of Islamic principle, it would remove their need to have sex outside marriage, Mohammed.
Well, the question for me is one of integrity and love.
So
at the same time,
on the issue that if you allowed gay people to marry, it would mean that their temptation to have sex outside marriage would not exist. And if that is the primary impulse of Islam, would that not be a good thing?
But integrity in that love means that we are bound by what Scripture says faithfully. And we can approach Scripture lovingly, seeking compassion for everybody of whatever sexual disposition. But with truthfulness and somebody who has stood firmly against homophobia, I would really like to find a verse in the Quran that positively endorses a same-sex sexual relationship. And that's really where I'm stuck.
Pav, can you find such a verse?
I can't point to that, but I argue the fact that the absence of such a verse does not mean, a rejection.
I want to bring us right up to date because, as I said in my introduction, the bill to legalise same-sex marriage is making its way through Parliament. And Ibrahim, the Muslim Council of Britain has made its position very clear.
Yes, our position is very clear. Marriage is a union, a contract within Muslim traditions between a man and a woman.
Pav,
my view is that I think within the Muslim world we have a more fundamental problem. Never mind gay marriage and the luxury of gay marriage. We have a fundamental problem of accepting the right of homosexuals to exist. That to me is far more fundamental than whether we can entertain the idea of gay marriage or civil partnerships. When you're fundamentally not recognised and you're not accorded any respect or the right to exist, and you're constantly forced to deny yourselves, and in many instances pushed outside of Islam. So you have a fundamental jihad just to stay within the faith.
Yes, it's a difficult issue. Culturally, people within Muslim communities will find it very difficult to accept and embrace a person who has homosexual or lesbian tendencies. And this is where we come in to try and explain to them, to say we have to make a distinction between the person and the sin. Just like heterosexual people are also sinful, this is to be looked at and approached in a similar way.
Muhammad.
I think truth calls us to recognise that, as we all know, genetic studies, behavioural studies, determine that human sexuality is not fixed. It's multifactorial. It has both intrinsic and extrinsic elements to it. It changes over time, and we need to recognise human sexuality as part of all of us.
But the rejection,
as
the pain and the rejection comes from the feeling that they are not accepted, that gay people have no place within an Islamic society.
And that is entirely wrong, and I will stand foursquare in opposition to that. At the same time, as people who have come, or certainly in the case of us who are second generation, those whose parents have come in and had their passports stamped to sign up to living under a non-Muslim prince. It is absolutely not our place as a minority faith to seek to impose our views on a majority community that have not bought into the covenant of living an Islamic lifestyle.
But you can attempt to influence the public discourse.
Well, we are called by the principle of enjoining that which is right and forbidding that which is wrong to express our conscientious view, but to do so in a balanced way. So, for example, I wish the MCB would have a lot more to say about economic justice and global poverty than it has to say about sex.
Pav.
I concur with Brother Mohammed there. I think our preoccupation with sex is just completely disproportionate.
If a close friend or relative told you that they wanted to marry their same-sex partner, what would you say, Ibrahim?
I would tell them it's not possible. I would explain to them the terms and conditions of marriage in Islam, and I would encourage them to give up transgressing in the eyes of God.
Muhammad. Within Islam, there is a framework for close same-sex relationships between men, which is a covenanted brotherhood and incorporates all the elements of love. And I would commend them to participate in that traditional form of brotherhood.
Pav?
I'd like them to subscribe to a commitment, a Quranically ethical commitment to their partner, and I would welcome that relationship.
That's all for this week. My thanks to Pav Akhtar, Muhammad Al-Hussaini and Ibrahim Mogra. I'll be back at the same time next week. Do join me.